At a time where many cars have become so digital and soulless, what's left behind is a dying breed. The days of manual transmissions paired to a legendary V8 engine may be nearing a close. However, some legends never die. The C6 Corvette Z06 is one of the best value, most analog, pure driver's cars on the market right now, but they're getting harder to find. Today, we're going to figure out why. Let's talk a little bit about what it's like to actually drive the C6 Z06. And the first thing that you're going to notice that will tell you quite a lot about the car is the fact that it looks like I have a cameraman sitting on the dashboard that is miserably inebriated. But I assure you that that is not the case. This car is just that raw and really glued and connected to the road, and every little vibration that you feel comes right on through the cabin. And that's a result of the fact that the Z06 is meant to be the track-oriented version of the Corvette. Now, the main kind of highlight to the Z06 is the LS7 that comes underneath the hood. It's a 7-liter naturally aspirated V8, which is pretty much one of the largest that you are ever going to be able to find, and that directly translates to torque in the form of 470 pound-feet of it that can be found very low in the RPM band, and makes it very easy to build speed in this car, and just makes the entire experience feel completely effortless. And in terms of horsepower, that LS7 is certainly no slouch either. It produces 505 horsepower, 100 more than the previous generation of the Z06, and results in a 3.5 second 0 to 60 time for this car. And mind you that this car is 10 years old. This is a 2013, it's now 2023. So think about how crazy a 3.5 second 0 to 60 time would be in a car of this age and at that time, especially for something that costs well under $100,000. So getting a bit into the sound of the LS7, I don't think that it is widely disputed or challenged that it is one of the best sounding American V8 engines ever made. It has a relatively high redline at 7,000 RPM, which is significantly higher than most LS engines that come in the 62 to 6,400 range. And as a result, up high from 5 to 7,000 RPM, you just get a sound that is pretty much the textbook definition of a howling and screaming American V8. Now, down low, I consider it the car that never really shuts up. It makes all sorts of pops, bangs, and booms that just resonate throughout the entire cabin anytime that you shift or pretty much do anything and give any input to the engine. And I think that's partially due to the fact that this car came with a dual mode exhaust from factory like the Grand Sport or ZR1, with some valves in each exhaust tube that remain closed when you're not beating the car and when the inputs are light to keep the ride much more livable and calm. But the minute that you give the car any kind of hard acceleration or drastic input, these valves will open up and make the exhaust and engine much louder to allow you to experience that with no cost or detriment to ride quality and livability. Now, there's a fuse in the fuse box that makes this entire system work, and in this particular car, that fuse was removed. And what that does is it makes the valves pretty much permanently open, and the car becomes effectively permanently loud, which is why I think it makes so much noise down low in the RPM band where those valves would normally be closed. And now that I've talked all these great things about the LS7 engine, let's see how it actually pulls. Drop it in a second, and here we go. Yeah, that is properly quick. That is legitimately like a freight train. There's just torque everywhere. The car just pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls, and you don't really feel like you have to give it so much. Now, oddly enough, on the flip side of that, the Z06 is not scary at all. The car stays very planted under pretty much any condition and input that you give it, and never really breaks loose unless you are trying to make it break loose. And that's partially due to the 325 Goodyear Eagle F1 tires that are on the back of this and are extremely sticky and definitely do not allow for any slippage. But I also think that that's a byproduct of the fact that 505 horsepower is probably right on that edge where if you go any higher into something like a C7 Z06, it starts to get to the point where it's too much power for the amount of weight that's over the rear wheels, and you start to lose and break traction. I think this car is perfectly balanced and right on that edge where it's extremely drivable without being scary. scary and doesn't do anything that's going to surprise you, but is not any slouch by any stretch of the imagination. Now, getting into the suspension and handling of the Z06, this is really where this car should be separating itself from the other variations of the C6 Corvette, and I can say it does do exactly that. Now, the suspension is very stiff. I think that the dampers on this car, the coefficient's probably nearing over-damped. Any kind of vertical response or input that is put into this car, any kind of bump that you hit, is damped out near instantaneously, and the springs are very stiff as well, which really makes the car feel glued to the road. Now, the downside of this is that the ride quality is certainly compromised. Every little tiny bump, I'm doing like 35 miles an hour right now, comes through the cabin. You can feel the entire car shake and vibrate with every little kind of variation in the road, and although that might get irritating for long drives or anything like that, when it comes to the actual performance of the car, it certainly works out pretty good, because anywhere that I want to put the nose of this car, it responds near instantaneously as a result of that very tightly knit suspension. And oddly enough, I do own a base model C6 Corvette, and that car, the front end feels long, and it is long in both cars. It's structurally pretty much exactly the same. But for whatever reason, because the suspension is so well mannered in this car, the front end feels short. It doesn't feel long and swingy like it does in my base model, but rather tiny and agile, and it wants to just go wherever you tell it to. And I think that's pretty interesting because, like I said, structurally it's the exact same, but purely through suspension tactics and engineering, they've managed to make the car feel lightweight, agile, and very just nifty. And on a track where this car belongs, that likely is going to translate to much sharper turn-in and a lot less understeer. Now, the other kind of component of the handling and suspension that I want to touch on is the steering. And I'll be honest, it feels like most other Corvettes. It's kind of floaty, very smooth and lightweight, and that is certainly nice from a livability standpoint. There's not a ton of communication and vibration that comes through the road that is felt through the steering wheel, but I will say that the dead zone on it is much tighter. On my base model, the kind of middle of the steering wheel, whenever the wheel is nearly straight, there's a bit of play in it before you actually start to turn the wheels, whereas this steering rack certainly feels a little bit tighter with no play or a dead zone in it really at all. This car is equipped with the same transmission that you get in the C6 ZR1, and that is a Tremec TR6060. It's a very smooth shifter, pretty short throws, and each gear just kind of clicks right in without any effort. Very smooth shifter, and I don't really have any complaints about it. No slop in it at all, in or out of gear. The transmission does not move around at all. The clutch is really light and livable. This would be a good car if you don't know how to drive stick shift, which, by the way, these things only come in stick shift, so if you want one, you're going to have to learn. But it would be a good car to learn on because it is so easy to modulate and work with. So overall, some of my final thoughts of what it's like to be driving the C6 Z06 is that the highlight of the car really is under the hood. The LS7 is such a phenomenal engine. 7 liters of naturally aspirated V8 is really all a car guy could ask for. Pair that with rear-wheel drive and a great Tremec TR6060 manual transmission, and this is one of the most analog and just great cars to drive, especially at this price point. So now that we're outside of the car, let's talk a little bit about the exterior and styling of the C6 Z06. First and foremost, this particular 2013 model is in torch red and was one of 65 made. So these cars as a whole are not super common. Now, in terms of looks, the Z06 also falls right in between the base model and the ZR1 in my opinion, being kind of a hybrid between the two. Your front end is quite a bit wider than a base model, as this car comes with a factory wide body kit that carries into your front fenders as well as your rear fenders, and allowed Chevy to get a wider wheel and wider tire on there, allowing the track version of the Corvette to get the traction that it deserves. Now, in your front bumper that is a little bit wider, you do have 2 functional vents. The first is the air dam right over the logo, which allows some cooling to get in towards your engine bay. And your second is down below your front headlight and is just a big tube on the other side of that vent that leads through a channel and blows cool air around and onto the back of your front brake discs, which are drilled, by the way, to also help with cooling. Now, getting a little bit more into the wheel area, it's a 10-spoke Spider design from factory that I think looks pretty great. Most Corvette wheels are just kind of middle of the road in my opinion, especially like the base model C6, for example, but I think they really knocked it out of the park with this one, and these wheels look really good, especially with this chrome finish. I think it really goes nicely with the torch red paint. Now, you get 6 piston brake calipers in the front and 4 piston brake calipers in the rear, and those do provide plenty of stopping power. Also in this area is the wheel fitment, which I think looks pretty nice from factory. It's not so high that it's an off-road vehicle, but it's also not too low to the point where you scrape everywhere you go. Now, in this side fender, this is, like I said, that factory wide body kit. It carries over into another functional air vent that allows hot air to escape that front brake, and also comes with a Z06 badge on the side to let everyone know that this is not your regular Corvette. Now, as we move back a little bit further, the biggest difference that you will see on the Z06 is the fact that the roof does not come off. This is not a targa and removable roof like most Corvettes, but rather a fixed roof, as for track usage that's probably a little bit safer and is also maybe a little bit lighter weight. Getting a bit more into the rear of the car, you also have those really wide fender flares that I think are the most prevalent when you're looking from either the dead front or dead back of the car. It's really obvious that this is not your regular Corvette. And that allows them to house those 325 Goodyear Eagle F1 tires that provide plenty of traction to this car. As far as the rear end is concerned, all you have back there is your quad tip dual mode exhaust from factory. As we touched on, that sounds absolutely incredible. Now, regarding the spoiler, you would typically see a small centered one on a regular C6 Corvette. However, the Z06 receives a slightly upgraded version, being a full plastic black spoiler that goes across the entirety of the rear end. And that arrow is also on the front end with this kind of flat plastic black splitter that goes across the front of your front bumper. I think it looks pretty nice. It's definitely not a crazy nice material like the carbon fiber that you would get on something like the ZR1, but it adds a nice touch to the car and certainly makes it look a little bit more aggressive. Overall, the Z06 is certainly a great looking car from the outside, and when it's coming down the road at you, it's no question in your mind that this is not your regular Corvette. So now, sitting inside of the interior of the C6 Z06, there is a good amount to go over. First and foremost, the steering wheel is pretty much the same as any other Corvette, as well as your entire gauge cluster with your standard big tachometer and speedometer in the middle. It's very nice and easy to see. Additionally, there's the heads-up display in the dashboard. That's a pretty standard thing among all Corvettes, but in this car it shows you your speed, your RPM, G-force if you are going around a turn, and plenty of other useful information. Now, one of the nice features of the Z06 interior is that the doors and your dashboard come wrapped in this nice kind of leather material, opposed to any kind of cheap plastic that you would typically see. On top of that, this entire trim piece in the center is made of carbon fiber, opposed to just a painted plastic, and I think it certainly adds a nice touch. It makes the car feel slightly more upscale. As we come down into this region, your entire infotainment system is the same as any other C6 Corvette, as well as your shift knob, and the glove box is also wrapped in that nice leather material. On top of that, you get Bose speakers, as this is a 3LZ, being the highest trim of the Z06, and they sound really, really nice. The car is a push-to-start like any other C6 Corvette, and the pedals are nicely spaced, with the gas pedal being mounted from the top, and the brake and clutch pedal being positioned pretty nicely for heel-toe downshifts. Now, what I think is really the highlight of this particular C6 Z06 interior is the seats. Now, both the Z06 and the ZR1 got upgraded seats for the final 2 years of production, being 2012 and 2013. Now, I just reviewed a 2010 ZR1, so that did not have these seats, so I can directly compare them to what you get before 2012 and 2013, and I can certainly attest to the fact that these are a lot nicer. Now, the seats that we have in this car have very wide bolsters, opposed to the slightly thinner ones in the earlier model seats, and my favorite part about them is that there's this entire center piece of the seat that comes in this nice kind of fabric suede material and has a very high coefficient of friction. Pretty much what all of this means is that it's really hard to slip around in these seats because they hold you in both with these bolsters and this nice grippy material in the middle. I'd feel completely comfortable taking this car on a track in its stock form and not be worried about flying all over the place like you would in some stock cars. And in those scenarios, you'd much prefer getting something like an actual harness to hold you in. In this car, I don't think that's necessary, and I think they honestly nailed these seats from the factory. It's a thumbs up from me. And the last thing that I want to touch on in the interior is actually the storage space, and it's the same as any other C6 Corvette. You just get the big hatch in the back, and I've daily driven a C6, and it is plenty of room, especially for a sports car of this caliber. I think it's a pretty impressive storage space. As years pass, many cars are forgotten, but some are very special. The Z06 is a car that earns this title, executing the basics near flawlessly. A simple formula consisting of a V8, manual transmission, and rear-wheel drive executed near perfection, all without burning your wallet. This has been a car review with Running to Redline. Thank you for watching and have a great day.